In the spring of 1943, inside a dimly lit concert hall in occupied Warsaw, a blind pianist sat at a Steinway grand piano and played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major with such precision that Nazi officers in the front row closed their eyes in rapture. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly suspected, was that woven into the fabric of that beautiful performance were exact coordinates for a weapons drop, the location of a safe house, and instructions for an assassination attempt on a high-ranking SS officer. The pianist's name was Viktor Mendelsohn, and by the time the war ended, he had memorized and transmitted over 200 secret messages through his performances, each one hidden in plain sight, each one a death sentence if discovered. This is the story of how a man who couldn't see became the eyes of the resistance, and how the Nazis applauded their own destruction night after night without ever knowing it. Warsaw in 1943 was a city that had learned to exist in two realities simultaneously. On the surface, under the iron grip of Nazi occupation, life appeared to follow a grotesque semblance of normalcy. The theaters remained open, restaurants served meals to German officers and collaborators, and the occupiers insisted on maintaining a veneer of civilization even as they systematically dismantled Polish culture and murdered its people. The Nazis understood something crucial about control, that a population allowed small pleasures, carefully monitored artistic expression, and the illusion of cultural continuity would be easier to subjugate than one pushed entirely into darkness. Music, in particular, held a special place in this twisted arrangement. The Germans considered themselves patrons of high culture, and they demanded performances that would remind them of home, of a world where they were not occupiers, but civilized people who appreciated the finer things. Concert halls became stages for this elaborate fiction, places where swastika banners hung alongside portraits of Beethoven and Bach. Viktor Mendelsohn had been born blind in 1908 in the Jewish quarter of Krakow, the son of a violin maker who recognized his child's extraordinary gift before the boy turned 5. By the age of 7, Viktor could reproduce any piece of music after hearing it just once, his fingers finding the keys with an accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. His father scraped together every zloty to secure lessons with the finest teachers in Poland, and by his 20th birthday, Viktor had performed in concert halls across Europe, his blindness transforming from a disability into part of his mystique. Audiences were mesmerized by the sight of this young man who navigated complex compositions entirely from memory, who seemed to hear music in dimensions that sighted people could never access. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, Viktor was performing in Vienna, and he made the fateful decision to return home rather than seek safety in the West. He would later tell members of the resistance that he heard his country calling to him in the same way he heard music, as something that existed beyond sight, beyond reason, something that demanded his presence. The occupation transformed everything Viktor had known, but it also presented an unexpected opportunity. The Nazis, in their arrogance and their obsession with maintaining cultural superiority, insisted on preserving certain musical institutions. They needed Viktor Mendelsohn, needed his talent to prove to themselves and to the world that they were not barbarians, but inheritors of European civilization. A blind Jewish pianist was deemed less threatening than others, who might harbor resistance sympathies, someone whose disability made him seem dependent, controllable, incapable of meaningful opposition. The Nazis made a calculation that would prove to be their fatal mistake. They believed that a man who could not see could not effectively spy, could not carry messages, could not become a weapon against them. They allowed Viktor to continue performing, even arranged for him to play in officers' clubs and official functions, never suspecting that his blindness was not a weakness, but the very thing that made him the perfect instrument of resistance. It was in the winter of 1942 that Anna Kowalski, a former music teacher who had become one of the most effective resistance leaders in Warsaw, approached Viktor with a proposal that seemed impossible. The resistance needed a method to communicate that could bypass Nazi surveillance, something that could happen in public in front of enemy eyes without arousing suspicion. Traditional methods of passing messages, dead drops and couriers and coded letters, were becoming increasingly dangerous as the Gestapo tightened its grip on the city. Anna had been watching Viktor's performances, studying the way the Nazis relaxed in his presence, the way they allowed themselves to be vulnerable to beauty even in the midst of their brutality. She realized that Viktor's concerts could become something else entirely, a transmission system hidden inside artistic expression, and she needed to know if the pianist would risk everything to make it possible. Viktor Mendelsohn listened to Anna's proposal in a basement room that smelled of damp stone and old coal, and he agreed without hesitation. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that music was never just sound, never just entertainment, but a language capable of carrying meaning that transcended words. He had spent his entire life translating emotion into notes, finding patterns in chaos, memorizing vast architectures of sound that existed only in his mind. The resistance needed someone who could hold dozens of messages simultaneously in their memory, who could encode them into performances, and who could do so under the watchful eyes of the enemy without revealing the slightest trace of deception. Viktor told Anna that he would become their code, their messenger, their secret weapon hidden behind Chopin and Beethoven. He would turn his blindness into sight for those who needed to see, and he would make the Nazis dance to the rhythm of their own destruction. The system that Anna Kowalski and her cell developed with Viktor was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. Every piece of classical music, they realized, already contained a natural structure of patterns, repetitions, and variations that could be manipulated without arousing suspicion. A pianist was expected to interpret, to add personal flourishes, to emphasize certain passages over others. Viktor would memorize a base message, a string of information that needed to reach another cell or coordinate an operation, and then he would translate that message into musical variations. A slight acceleration in tempo during the second movement of a Beethoven sonata might indicate a change in meeting location. An unexpected trill in a Chopin prelude could signal danger. The repetition of a specific phrase, played 3 times instead of 2, might communicate a date or a time. To anyone listening casually, to the Nazi officers who filled the concert halls, these were simply the interpretive choices of a gifted musician, the natural expression of artistic temperament. But to trained resistance members scattered throughout the audience, members who had been taught the code, each performance was a detailed intelligence briefing delivered in real time. The training process was brutal and unforgiving because there was no margin for error. Viktor would meet with Anna and other resistance leaders in the hours before dawn, in locations that changed every few days to avoid detection. They would feed him information, coordinates written in a numerical system, names of collaborators who needed to be eliminated, schedules of German troop movements, locations of hidden weapons caches. Viktor would close his eyes, though the gesture was unnecessary, and he would repeat the information back until it was burned into his memory with the same permanence as the musical compositions he had learned as a child. Then came the harder part, the translation of raw data into musical code. He had to decide which piece would carry which message, had to ensure that the variations he introduced were subtle enough to pass unnoticed by casual listeners, but distinct enough to be caught by those who knew what to listen for. A single mistake, a message garbled or misunderstood, could lead to the capture and execution of dozens of resistance fighters. The weight of those lives sat on Viktor's shoulders every time his fingers touched the keys. By the spring of 1943, Viktor was performing 3 to 4 times per week, and each performance carried multiple encoded messages. The Nazis had grown so comfortable with his presence that they began requesting him specifically for important events. When high-ranking SS officers visited Warsaw, Viktor was brought in to provide entertainment. When collaborationist officials held celebrations, he was the featured performer. The resistance exploited this access ruthlessly. Anna's network placed trained listeners in the audience whenever possible, sometimes as cleaning staff, sometimes as guests who had managed to secure invitations through various means. These listeners would attend the concerts with their eyes closed, their entire focus on the music, memorizing the variations and deviations that Viktor introduced. After each performance, they would disappear into the night and transcribe what they had heard, converting musical code back into actionable intelligence that would be distributed throughout the resistance network before dawn. The psychological toll on Viktor was immense in ways that no one around him fully understood. He was living multiple lives simultaneously, each one demanding perfect performance. To the Nazis, he had to remain the grateful, apolitical artist, someone who appreciated their patronage and seemed content to serve as a cultural ornament in their occupied city. To the resistance, he was a critical intelligence asset whose failure could unravel entire operations. To himself, in the quiet moments between performances, he was a man carrying the weight of 200 lives and counting, each message he memorized representing real people who would live or die based on his accuracy. He could not afford to forget a single detail, could not allow fear or exhaustion to corrupt his memory. Other resistance members could be captured and replaced, their roles assumed by others in the network. Viktor was irreplaceable, and he knew it, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone that grew heavier with each passing week. The breaking point nearly came in May of 1943, when the Nazis began to suspect that intelligence was leaking from their carefully controlled cultural events. Captain Franz Weber, an SS officer responsible for security and cultural affairs, started attending Viktor's performances with increasing frequency. He would sit in the front row, his eyes never leaving the pianist, studying every movement, every expression, listening with an intensity that went beyond appreciation. Weber was no fool, and he understood that information could hide in unexpected places. After one particularly crucial performance, where Viktor had transmitted details of a planned German ammunition depot raid, Weber approached him backstage, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, Viktor was certain that everything was about to end. The captain stood close enough that Viktor could smell his cologne, could feel the heat radiating from his body, and then Weber said something that made Viktor's blood run cold. He remarked that the performance had been particularly inspired that evening, that there was something different in the way Viktor had played the third movement, something he couldn't quite identify, but that had moved him deeply. The encounter with Captain Weber changed everything about how Viktor and the resistance operated, forcing them to evolve their methods in ways that pushed the boundaries of what seemed humanly possible. Anna made the decision that they could no longer rely on regular patterns or predictable encoding systems, because Weber had demonstrated something terrifying. He was listening not just as an officer fulfilling his duties, but as someone who genuinely understood music, someone who could potentially detect patterns if they became too repetitive. The resistance needed to make Viktor's code even more sophisticated, more layered, more impossible to detect. They began using what Anna called nested encoding, where a single performance might contain 3 or 4 different messages, each one hidden at a different level of musical interpretation. The tempo variations might communicate one set of instructions, the dynamic changes another, the pedal work yet another, and the ornamentation a fourth. Viktor had to hold all of these layers in his mind simultaneously, had to execute them flawlessly while appearing to be lost in artistic expression, while Nazi officers sat mere feet away from him, analyzing every note. The memorization techniques Viktor developed during this period bordered on the superhuman, and would later be studied by psychologists trying to understand the limits of human memory. He began treating each message as if it were a separate musical composition, creating what he called memory palaces, built entirely from sound. For a message about weapon coordinates, he might associate each number with a specific chord progression, each location with a melodic phrase. He would then rehearse these imaginary compositions in his mind for hours, playing them on invisible keyboards until they became as familiar to him as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Chopin's Nocturnes. By the summer of 1943, Viktor could hold up to 15 distinct messages in his working memory at any given time, each one precisely encoded, each one ready to be transmitted through his performances. He never wrote anything down, never created physical records that could be discovered during a raid. Everything existed only in the architecture of his mind, in neural pathways that had been trained through decades of musical practice to retain vast quantities of complex information. The performances themselves became a form of psychological warfare that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Viktor was not just transmitting information to the resistance, he was also manipulating the emotional state of his Nazi audience in ways that served strategic purposes. When the resistance needed to create a sense of security and complacency among German officers, Viktor would play pieces that emphasized beauty, harmony, and resolution, music that made the occupiers feel safe and civilized and in control. When the goal was to plant seeds of unease, to make the Nazis slightly more paranoid and reactive, he would introduce subtle dissonances, unexpected harmonies that created a feeling of something being not quite right, though the listeners could never identify exactly what was disturbing them. Hannah's network began to realize that they could use Viktor not just as a messenger, but as a psychological weapon, someone who could influence the mood and decision-making of enemy officers without them ever knowing they were being manipulated. The Nazis would leave Viktor's concerts feeling vaguely anxious or overconfident, and those emotional states would affect their subsequent actions in ways that the resistance could predict and exploit. But the constant proximity to danger, the unrelenting pressure of living a triple life, was eroding Viktor's psychological defenses in ways that became harder to hide. He began experiencing what he later described as auditory hallucinations during performances, moments where he would hear messages that weren't there, phantom codes that he hadn't actually memorized. He would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that he had forgotten a crucial detail, that somewhere in Warsaw a resistance fighter was walking into a trap because Viktor had transposed two numbers or reversed a sequence. Anna noticed that he was losing weight, that his hands sometimes trembled before performances, that he had developed a habit of compulsively reviewing messages even when there was no practical need to do so. She knew they were pushing him beyond sustainable limits, but she also knew that the intelligence he was providing had saved hundreds of lives and was actively disrupting Nazi operations across occupied Poland. The moral calculation was brutal and unavoidable. Viktor's sacrifice was enabling the survival and effectiveness of the entire resistance network. The summer of 1943 brought a development that would test Viktor's abilities and courage in ways that nothing had before. The resistance received intelligence that a major German operation was being planned, something that would involve mass deportations from the Warsaw ghetto, and a final solution to what the Nazis called the Jewish problem in Poland. The details were fragmentary and scattered across multiple sources, and the resistance needed to piece together a complete picture before they could organize any kind of response or evacuation. Anna made the decision to use Viktor's upcoming concert at the German Officers' Club, a prestigious event that would be attended by some of the highest-ranking Nazis in occupied Poland, to transmit the most complex and detailed message he had ever attempted. The information included dates, locations, unit designations, transportation schedules, and specific names of SS officers involved in the planning. It was not one message, but rather a complete intelligence report, something that would normally require pages of written documentation. Viktor had 1 week to memorize it all and then embed it into a single performance of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, a piece that would last approximately 35 minutes and would be his only opportunity to warn the resistance about what was coming. The week leading up to the Rachmaninoff performance became a descent into a kind of controlled madness that Viktor would later describe as the closest he ever came to losing himself completely. Anna and her lieutenants brought him the intelligence in fragments, pieces of information gathered from informants inside the German administration, from intercepted communications, from Polish workers who had overheard conversations in Nazi offices. Each piece had to be verified, cross-referenced, and then compressed into a form that Viktor could encode without arousing suspicion. They worked in the abandoned bookstore basement that still smelled of burnt paper from a fire that had consumed thousands of volumes during the initial invasion. Viktor sat at a battered upright piano that was missing several keys, and he practiced the Rachmaninoff obsessively, finding places within the concerto's sprawling architecture where he could hide the information. The first movement's opening chords, massive and declarative, would carry the primary dates of the planned deportation. The lyrical second movement would encode the transportation routes and assembly points. The explosive third movement would communicate the unit designations and the names of commanding officers. It was an impossible task, and yet Viktor had no choice but to make it possible. The physical act of memorization required Viktor to transform his entire body into an instrument of retention. He stopped sleeping more than 2 or 3 hours per night, using the darkness to rehearse the encoded messages in his mind, playing through the concerto on imaginary keyboards, checking and rechecking each variation against the intelligence he had been given. He developed a system of physical anchors, associating certain pieces of information with specific sensations in his fingers, the pressure required for a particular chord, the stretch needed for a difficult interval. The date of the deportation became linked to the feeling of his left hand spanning a tenth in the opening bars. The name of the SS colonel coordinating the operation was encoded in a trill that required a specific tension in his right wrist. His body became a map of secrets, each muscle memory containing information that could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of people. Anna watched him deteriorate, saw the way his face grew gaunt, and his hands developed a slight tremor during practice, but she also knew that there was no alternative, no backup plan, if Viktor failed. The night of the performance arrived with the weight of everything that depended on its success. The German Officers' Club had been decorated for the occasion, swastika banners hanging alongside crystal chandeliers, tables laden with food and wine that had been confiscated from Polish homes and businesses. Viktor was led to the piano by a German aide who treated him with the kind of condescending gentleness that the Nazis reserved for those they considered defective but useful. Captain Weber was there, seated in his usual position in the front row, his eyes already fixed on Viktor with that unsettling intensity that suggested he was looking for something, though he couldn't say exactly what. Scattered throughout the audience were 4 resistance members who had managed to secure positions as serving staff, and one who had obtained an invitation through forged credentials. These 5 people would be responsible for capturing and transcribing every encoded detail that Viktor transmitted. If even one of them missed a crucial element, if the message was incomplete, the resistance would be operating with partial intelligence, making decisions based on fragmentary information that could lead to catastrophic mistakes. Viktor's hands found the keys, and in the moment before he began to play, he experienced a clarity that cut through all the fear and exhaustion. He understood that he was about to do something that existed at the intersection of art and espionage, that the same fingers that would create beauty would simultaneously transmit information that could save lives and destroy Nazi plans. The opening chords of the Rachmaninoff crashed through the room, and buried within that powerful sound were the dates, August 7th and August 8th, 1943. The Nazis in the audience leaned back in their chairs, their eyes closing in appreciation, completely unaware that they were listening to their own secrets being broadcast back to their enemies. Viktor moved through the first movement with a precision that felt almost supernatural. His blind eyes seeing nothing and everything simultaneously, his mind holding dozens of separate threads of information, while his fingers executed one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Each variation he introduced was slight enough to pass as artistic interpretation, but distinct enough to be caught by trained ears. The resistance members in the audience didn't move, didn't acknowledge each other, but each one was absorbing the information, committing it to memory exactly as Viktor had done. The second movement brought a different kind of challenge, because here the music became intimate and lyrical, and Viktor needed to encode detailed geographical information without disrupting the emotional flow that the Nazis expected. He found spaces within the melody to introduce ornamentations that spelled out street names and district numbers, using a system that translated locations into musical intervals. The beauty of the movement provided cover for the complexity of what he was transmitting, the Nazis hearing only the gorgeous lines, while the resistance members decoded transportation routes and assembly points. By the time the third movement exploded into its virtuosic finale, Viktor was operating in a state that transcended normal consciousness, his entire being focused on the dual task of creating art and transmitting intelligence. The names of SS officers emerged in the rapid-fire passages, each name encoded in a specific rhythmic pattern that would be unmistakable to those who knew the code. When the final chords rang out and the audience erupted in applause, Viktor sat motionless at the piano, his shirt soaked with sweat, knowing that he had just transmitted the most complete and detailed intelligence report of his entire career as a resistance operative, and that not a single person in that room except the 5 scattered listeners had any idea what had just occurred. The intelligence that Viktor transmitted during the Rachmaninoff performance reached the resistance leadership within 3 hours of the concert's conclusion, and what they discovered in the decoded messages was more horrifying than anyone had anticipated. The Nazi plan was not simply another deportation operation, but rather a coordinated extermination effort that would eliminate the remaining population of the Warsaw ghetto in a matter of days. The dates Viktor had encoded, August 7th and 8th, gave the resistance less than 2 weeks to organize a response, to warn the ghetto inhabitants, and to prepare for what would become one of the most desperate acts of defiance in the entire war. The transportation routes and assembly points he had transmitted allowed resistance leaders to identify potential ambush locations and escape routes. The names of the SS officers involved provided targets for assassination attempts that might disrupt the German command structure. Every detail that Viktor had memorized and encoded into those 35 minutes of music became a weapon that the resistance could use to fight back against what seemed like an unstoppable machine of destruction. But the success of the transmission also marked Viktor as someone who was becoming too valuable to risk, and Anna faced a decision that tore at the core of what the resistance was trying to achieve. Several members of the leadership argued that Viktor should be extracted from Warsaw immediately, moved to a safe location where he could survive the war and potentially testify about what he had witnessed and accomplished. They pointed out that he had already transmitted over 150 messages, that his contribution to the resistance effort was beyond measure, and that losing him to capture or execution would be a catastrophe not just for operational reasons, but for historical ones. Anna understood their arguments, but she also understood something else. Viktor would never agree to leave. His entire identity had become intertwined with his role as the blind pianist who played for the Nazis, while secretly transmitting their destruction. To remove him from that role would be to strip away the only thing that gave meaning to his existence in this nightmare world the occupation had created. She made the decision to allow him to continue, knowing that she was potentially condemning him to death, knowing that every additional performance increased the probability of discovery. The Nazi response to the intelligence failure that resulted from Viktor's transmission was swift and brutal, even though they didn't yet understand how the information had leaked. The planned deportation was disrupted by resistance actions that seemed impossibly well coordinated, as if the Polish fighters had access to German planning documents. Ambushes occurred at exactly the right locations, escape routes had been prepared in advance, and key SS officers found themselves targeted for assassination in ways that suggested detailed knowledge of their movements and responsibilities. Captain Weber, who had survived an attempt on his life that missed him by mere seconds, became obsessed with finding the source of the intelligence breach. He began reviewing everything that had occurred in the days leading up to the operation, trying to identify patterns, connections, anything that might explain how the resistance had obtained such detailed information. His investigation led him back again and again to cultural events, to gatherings where German officers had been present, to performances and concerts where security had been relatively relaxed because the attendees were considered trustworthy. Viktor performed 3 more times in September of 1943, each concert carrying encoded messages that continued to support resistance operations across Warsaw. But he could feel the net tightening around him, could sense in the questions that German officials asked, in the way Captain Weber watched him during performances, that suspicion was growing. The Nazi security apparatus was beginning to understand that their cultural events might be compromised, even if they couldn't yet identify how or by whom. Viktor's hands developed a permanent tremor that he had to consciously suppress when he played, and he began experiencing moments of dissociation where he would lose track of whether he was encoding a real message or an imaginary one. The psychological pressure was fracturing something fundamental inside him, but he continued, because stopping would mean abandoning the people who depended on the intelligence he provided, would mean letting the Nazis win not just the war, but the battle for his soul. The breaking point came on October 12, 1943, during what was supposed to be a routine performance at a German administrative building. Viktor was playing Chopin, a relatively simple program that carried 3 encoded messages about resistance safe houses and supply routes. Halfway through the second piece, he became aware of a change in the atmosphere of the room, a tension that hadn't been there before. Captain Weber had entered quietly and was standing at the back of the hall, not sitting, just standing and watching with an intensity that Viktor could feel even though he couldn't see it. The performance continued, but Viktor knew with absolute certainty that something had shifted, that Weber had discovered something or suspected something, and that the game they had been playing for over a year was approaching its endgame. He finished the Chopin, received the usual polite applause, and was escorted back to his small apartment by a German aide who seemed more alert than usual, more watchful. That night, Viktor sat in darkness that was no different from the darkness he always experienced, and he prepared himself for the possibility that his next performance might be his last, that the code he had created and lived inside for so long was about to be broken, and that everything he had worked for might be about to unravel. Captain Weber's investigation had indeed uncovered a pattern, though not the one he was looking for, and his inability to identify the exact mechanism of intelligence leakage only intensified his obsession. He had compiled reports from Gestapo informants, cross-referenced them with resistance activities, and discovered that nearly every major operation that had been compromised in the past year had occurred within days of a significant cultural event attended by German officers. The correlation was undeniable, but the method remained invisible to him. Weber had interrogated musicians, arrested composers, detained conductors, but none of them had revealed anything useful because none of them were actually involved in the resistance network. He had searched concert halls for hidden microphones, examined sheet music for coded annotations, even brought in cryptography experts to analyze performances for patterns. They found nothing, because they were looking for external mechanisms, physical evidence of espionage, when the entire system existed in the mind of a single blind pianist who left no trail, no documents, no physical evidence of any kind. The resistance leadership knew they were running out of time, and they made the decision to extract as much intelligence as possible through Viktor before the inevitable discovery occurred. Anna met with him in late October, in a burnt-out church that still smelled of incense beneath the char, and she presented him with the most ambitious plan yet. The Germans were organizing a major strategic conference in early November, bringing together high-ranking officers from across occupied Poland to coordinate their response to increasing partisan activity. The conference would last 3 days, and each evening there would be cultural entertainment, including a performance by Viktor. The resistance wanted him to attend not just as a performer, but as an active listener, to absorb conversations, to observe who met with whom, to gather intelligence that went beyond what could be encoded in musical messages. They wanted him to become a spy in the most traditional sense, using his blindness and his presumed helplessness as cover to position himself in places where sensitive discussions might occur. The risk was exponentially higher than anything he had attempted before, because it required him to actively seek information rather than simply transmitting what he had been given. Viktor agreed without hesitation, though he understood that this mission was likely to be his last. The conference was scheduled to take place at a converted monastery outside Warsaw, a location that offered both security and isolation. Viktor would be housed on site for the duration, constantly surrounded by German officers, with no possibility of communication with the resistance until the conference concluded. He would need to memorize everything he heard and observed, then encode it all into his final performance on the third evening, a concert that would feature works by Wagner and Brahms, specifically requested by the German High Command. The amount of information he would need to retain was staggering, far beyond anything he had attempted even during the Rachmaninoff performance. He would be operating without a safety net, without the ability to verify details or ask for clarification, completely dependent on his memory and his ability to distinguish important intelligence from casual conversation. Anna watched his face as she explained the mission parameters, and she saw no fear there, only a kind of grim determination that came from having already accepted the inevitability of sacrifice. The 3 days at the monastery were a masterclass in invisible espionage that demonstrated just how much the Nazis had underestimated what a blind man could perceive. Viktor moved through the converted religious spaces like a ghost, guided by German aides who seated him in corners during meals, positioned him near doorways during breaks, and generally treated him as a piece of furniture that happened to produce music when required. The officers spoke freely in his presence, discussing troop movements, supply problems, partisan activity, upcoming operations, the political situation in Berlin, their frustrations with occupation policy. They assumed that a blind Jewish pianist posed no threat, that even if he could hear their conversations, he would have no way to transmit what he learned, no connection to the resistance network that was causing them so much trouble. Viktor sat motionless, his face composed in an expression of polite disinterest, while his mind catalogued every detail, every name, every location, every date that passed through the conversations swirling around him. He memorized the sound of voices, matching them to ranks and positions based on how other officers addressed them. He tracked the flow of people through rooms, building a mental map of who held power, who deferred to whom, where the real decision-making authority resided within the German command structure. By the evening of the third day, when Viktor sat down at the piano to perform the requested Wagner and Brahms program, he was carrying in his mind a complete intelligence portrait of Nazi command and operations across occupied Poland. The information was so extensive, so detailed, that he knew immediately he couldn't encode it all into a single performance without creating variations so extreme that they would finally reveal the system he had been using. He made a decision in that moment that was either brilliance or madness. He would encode only the most critical pieces of information into the music itself, the dates and locations of upcoming operations, the names of the highest value targets. Everything else, the broader strategic picture, the political tensions, the supply vulnerabilities, he would memorize in its raw form and trust that he would survive long enough to deliver it directly to Anna. It was a gamble that violated every security protocol the resistance had established, because it meant Viktor would become a walking repository of intelligence that couldn't be replaced if he was captured. But he also understood that the information he carried was too valuable to risk losing any of it through encoding errors or transmission failures. As his fingers began the opening bars of Wagner's Liebestod, Viktor committed himself to a new role. He was no longer just a messenger playing in code, but a witness who had to survive long enough to testify. The performance that evening achieved something Viktor had never managed before. It was simultaneously his greatest artistic triumph and his most dangerous intelligence operation, a convergence of beauty and espionage that pushed both disciplines to their absolute limits. The Wagner flowed from his fingers with an emotional depth that brought several German officers to tears, the music speaking to their nostalgia for a homeland many of them hadn't seen in years, for a world before war had transformed them into instruments of genocide. But woven into that beauty, hidden in tempo variations so subtle they seemed like natural expression, were the details of 3 major operations planned for December: a sweep through resistance safe houses in the Praga district, a crackdown on black market activities that were funding partisan operations, and most critically, a planned raid on a hospital where resistance leaders were known to meet under the guise of visiting wounded relatives. The Brahms that followed was darker, more introspective, and within its complex harmonies, Viktor encoded the names of 7 high-ranking SS officers who would be visiting Warsaw in the coming weeks, men whose assassination could significantly disrupt German command and control. He played for nearly 2 hours, and when the final notes faded into silence, the German officers rose as one in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, completely unaware that they had just applauded the transmission of intelligence that would lead to the deaths of their comrades and the failure of their operations. Captain Weber's applause was the most enthusiastic of all, but his eyes never left Viktor's face, searching for something that he couldn't articulate even to himself. After the performance, Weber approached the pianist with a bottle of expensive cognac and 2 glasses, suggesting they share a drink in private, an invitation that Viktor couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion. They sat in a small room that had once been a monk's cell, the stone walls holding the cold of centuries, and Weber poured the cognac with hands that were steadier than Viktor's had been during the performance. The captain began to speak, his voice carrying a strange mixture of admiration and suspicion, telling Viktor that he had never heard the Wagner played with such understanding, such depth of feeling, that it was as if the pianist could see into the souls of everyone listening. Weber asked questions that seemed casual but weren't, inquiring about how Viktor prepared for performances, how he memorized such complex pieces, whether he ever felt that music could communicate things beyond what the composer intended. Viktor responded with the careful honesty of someone who had rehearsed these conversations in his mind 1,000 times, explaining his techniques in ways that were truthful but revealed nothing about the dual purpose they served. The interrogation, because that's what it was despite the cognac and the compliments, continued for nearly an hour. Weber circled around the question he really wanted to ask, the suspicion that he couldn't quite formulate into concrete accusation. He mentioned that it was remarkable how often resistance operations seemed to be anticipated by the Germans' enemies, how intelligence appeared to leak from even the most secure environments. He noted that Viktor had performed at many of these secure gatherings, that his presence was a common thread running through events that had preceded compromised operations. Viktor felt his heart pounding, but kept his breathing steady, his face composed, relying on the fact that his blindness made his expressions harder to read, that Weber couldn't use eye contact and micro-expressions the way he might with a sighted suspect. Viktor responded that he was merely a musician, that the war and its intrigues were beyond his understanding, that he was grateful to be allowed to continue his art in such terrible times. The words were exactly what Weber would expect to hear from someone in Viktor's position, and yet they did nothing to quiet the captain's instincts, the nagging certainty that something was happening just beyond the edge of his perception. When Viktor finally returned to Warsaw 2 days later, he carried in his mind not just the intelligence he had encoded and transmitted during the performance, but dozens of additional details that represented the most comprehensive picture of German operations the resistance had ever possessed. He met with Anna in a different location every 6 hours over the next 3 days, systematically downloading everything he had observed, every conversation he had overheard, every detail he had committed to memory. Anna listened with growing amazement and horror, realizing that Viktor had essentially become a recording device, capturing nuances of tone and context that written documents could never convey. The intelligence he provided allowed the resistance to map the entire German command structure in occupied Poland, to identify vulnerabilities and opportunities that would shape their operations for months to come. But Anna also recognized that Viktor had crossed a line, that he had taken risks that went beyond what anyone had authorized, and that those risks had marked him in ways that might prove fatal. The immediate aftermath of the monastery conference validated every one of Anna's fears. Within a week, resistance operations based on Viktor's intelligence scored unprecedented successes. The raid on the hospital was ambushed, resulting in heavy German casualties and the capture of documents that further expanded resistance understanding of Nazi plans. 2 of the 7 SS officers Viktor had identified were killed in coordinated attacks that appeared impossibly well-timed. The black market crackdown was preempted by the resistance relocating their operations to locations the Germans hadn't discovered. Each success was also a clue for Weber, another piece of evidence that intelligence was leaking from the highest levels of German security. The captain intensified his investigation, and his focus narrowed with terrifying precision onto the one element that connected all of these compromised operations: the cultural events, the performances, and most specifically, the blind pianist who had been present at every single gathering where intelligence later proved to have been compromised. Weber still couldn't understand the mechanism, couldn't grasp how a blind man could be transmitting detailed military intelligence, but his instincts told him that Viktor Mendelsohn was the key to everything. And on November 28, 1943, he ordered the pianist's arrest. The Gestapo came for Viktor at 4 in the morning, the hour when human resistance is at its lowest, when the body and mind are least prepared to mount any kind of defense. 6 men entered his small apartment with weapons drawn, though Viktor posed no physical threat, their boots echoing on the wooden floors as they tore through his possessions, searching for evidence that didn't exist in physical form. They found sheet music, a metronome, some correspondence with other musicians, photographs from before the war showing Viktor at various concert halls across Europe. They found nothing incriminating because there was nothing to find. No code books, no encrypted messages, no weapons, no resistance literature. Everything that made Viktor dangerous existed only in his mind, in neural pathways that had been trained to hold vast quantities of information with perfect accuracy. The Gestapo agents grew frustrated as their search yielded nothing, and their frustration translated into roughness as they handcuffed Viktor and dragged him from his apartment into a truck that would take him to the interrogation cells beneath Gestapo headquarters, a place where the sounds that emerged were so terrible that even German officers avoided walking past the building if they could help it. Captain Weber was waiting when they brought Viktor into the interrogation room, a space that was deliberately kept too cold, with a single bright light positioned to disorient and exhaust prisoners even before questioning began. But the light meant nothing to Viktor, and this small advantage, this immunity to one of the Gestapo's standard techniques, seemed to infuriate Weber in ways that went beyond professional frustration. The captain began his interrogation with accusations that were simultaneously too vague and too specific, telling Viktor that he knew the pianist was involved in resistance activities, that intelligence had been leaking from events where Viktor performed, that the coincidences were too numerous to ignore. Viktor responded with confusion that wasn't entirely feigned, asking how a blind musician could possibly be involved in espionage, pointing out that he had no access to documents, no way to observe German operations, no connections to resistance networks. His defense was the same defense that had protected him for over a year, the assumption that blindness equated to helplessness, that a man who couldn't see couldn't effectively spy. Weber paced the room, his footsteps revealing his agitation, and he began to describe specific operations that had been compromised, asking Viktor where he had been on certain dates, what he had heard, who he had spoken with. The interrogation continued for 18 hours, a marathon of accusation and denial that pushed both men to the edges of their endurance. Weber brought in other interrogators, specialists who employed techniques ranging from psychological manipulation to physical intimidation. But Viktor maintained his position with a consistency that was either the truth or the most sophisticated lie any of them had ever encountered. He admitted to performing at German events, expressed gratitude for the opportunity to continue his art during the occupation, claimed ignorance of military matters and resistance activities. When they accused him of encoding messages into his performances, he asked them to explain how musical variations could possibly convey detailed military intelligence, challenged them to demonstrate the mechanism by which tempo changes or dynamic variations could communicate coordinates, dates, and names. The Gestapo interrogators found themselves in the impossible position of suspecting a method they couldn't prove existed, of believing in a conspiracy they couldn't demonstrate, without physical evidence, without witnesses who could testify to Viktor's resistance activities, without any concrete proof beyond statistical correlation. They had nothing that would stand up even to the minimal legal standards the Nazis maintained for show trials. But the Gestapo didn't need legal standards to hold someone indefinitely, and Weber made the decision to keep Viktor imprisoned while the investigation continued. Viktor was moved to a cell in Pawiak prison, the notorious facility where thousands of resistance members and ordinary Poles were held awaiting execution or deportation. The conditions were deliberately brutal: insufficient food, no medical care, temperatures that dropped below freezing at night, and the constant sounds of torture and execution that echoed through the stone corridors. Viktor existed in this hell for 3 weeks, and during that time, something inside him began to break in ways that interrogation never could. The isolation, the sensory deprivation that came from being locked in a cell where his blindness rendered him completely unable to orient himself, the sounds of suffering that never stopped, all of it worked on his mind like acid on metal. He began to lose track of time, to experience hallucinations where he heard music that wasn't being played, messages that hadn't been encoded, performances that existed only in his fragmenting consciousness. The resistance network that Anna commanded worked desperately to find a way to extract him, or at least to verify whether he had broken under interrogation, whether the entire code system had been compromised. But Pawiak was a fortress, and Viktor was being held in a section reserved for the highest value prisoners. The resolution came from an unexpected direction, from within the Nazi bureaucracy itself, where competing factions and personal rivalries often undermined operational effectiveness. A high-ranking SS officer who considered himself a patron of the arts heard about the arrest of the blind pianist who had performed at so many German cultural events, and he made inquiries that revealed the weakness of Weber's case. This officer, who had been moved to tears by Viktor's performance of Beethoven months earlier, found the idea that such an artist could be a spy to be not just unlikely, but aesthetically offensive, an insult to the transcendent power of music itself. He brought pressure to bear on the Gestapo leadership, arguing that holding Viktor without evidence was creating bad publicity, that it suggested the German administration in Poland was becoming paranoid and irrational. On December 21st, 1943, after nearly a month of imprisonment, Viktor was released with an official apology and a warning that he remained under surveillance, that any suspicious activity would result in immediate rearrest and execution. He walked out of Pawiak prison, weighing 20 pounds less than when he entered, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his mind carrying scars that would never fully heal, but he walked out alive, and that fact alone was a kind of miracle in occupied Warsaw in the winter of 1943. The resistance network that received Viktor back was not the same organization he had left, and Viktor himself was not the same man who had been dragged from his apartment a month earlier. Anna met him in a safe house that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, and she saw immediately that something fundamental had broken inside him during his time in Pawiak. His hands trembled constantly now, a visible manifestation of damage that went far deeper than physical nerves. He spoke in fragments, losing his train of thought mid-sentence, circling back to repeat things he had already said. Most troubling of all, he seemed to have lost the ability to distinguish between memories he had actually encoded and ones that existed only in his mind, between real messages and phantom communications that his traumatized consciousness had invented. Anna made the decision that should have been made months earlier. Viktor could no longer operate as an active intelligence asset. The psychological cost had become too high, and the risk of him making a fatal error, of encoding incorrect information or failing to transmit crucial details, was now greater than the value of keeping him in the field. She told him gently but firmly that his service to the resistance was complete, that he had given more than anyone had the right to ask, and that now he needed to focus on survival, on making it through the war, so that someday he could tell the world what he had accomplished. Viktor's response to his forced retirement revealed the depth of his psychological dependence on the role he had been playing. He begged Anna to reconsider, insisted that he could still perform, that the trembling in his hands would pass, that his mind was still sharp enough to hold and encode messages. He argued that the Nazis' release of him was actually an opportunity, that Weber's surveillance would eventually relax, that he could resume operations and be even more effective because the Germans had already investigated and cleared him. But Anna recognized these arguments for what they were, the desperate pleading of someone whose entire identity had become wrapped up in being useful, in having a purpose that justified his continued existence in a world that was trying to exterminate him and everyone like him. She held firm, and eventually Viktor accepted the decision with a resignation that was worse than anger would have been, a silent acknowledgement that he was no longer the person he had been, that Pawiak had taken something from him that could never be recovered. The resistance arranged for him to be moved to a series of safe houses, constantly relocating to stay ahead of German surveillance, and for the next 8 months, Viktor existed in a kind of limbo, alive but purposeless, surviving but not living. The war continued its grinding progression through 1944, and the intelligence network that Viktor had helped build continued to function even without him. The codes he had created were adapted and used by other operatives, musicians who lacked his perfect memory, but could still embed simple messages into performances. The resistance expanded its operations as the tide of war slowly began to turn against Germany, as Soviet forces pushed westward, and the Nazi grip on Poland started to weaken. Viktor heard about these developments secondhand, through whispered conversations in safe houses, through the distant sounds of artillery that grew progressively closer as the months passed. He tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life, practicing piano when instruments were available, teaching music theory to children in hiding, attempting to be useful in ways that didn't require the superhuman memory and nerves of steel that had once defined him. But the trembling in his hands never fully stopped, and he found that he could no longer play complex pieces without making errors, without his fingers betraying him in ways that would have been unthinkable before Pawiak. The liberation of Warsaw came in January of 1945, though liberation was perhaps too generous a word for what occurred. The Nazis, in their retreat, destroyed as much of the city as they could, reducing entire districts to rubble, executing prisoners en masse, burning documents, and eliminating witnesses. The Soviet forces that arrived found a city that was more graveyard than capital, a landscape of ruins inhabited by ghosts who had somehow survived the unsurvivable. Viktor was among those ghosts, and when Anna found him in the chaos of the first days after liberation, she barely recognized him. He had aged a decade in the 2 years since the war had begun to consume him. His face gaunt, his body frail, his blind eyes somehow seeming even more sightless than before. But he was alive, and in the accounting of that terrible war, being alive was victory enough. Anna told him that the intelligence he had provided had saved hundreds of lives, had disrupted dozens of German operations, had contributed in ways that couldn't be fully measured to the resistance effort that had made liberation possible. Viktor listened to these assurances with a distance that suggested he no longer fully believed in his own significance, that the price he had paid had somehow exceeded the value of what he had accomplished. The immediate post-war period brought new challenges that Viktor was ill-equipped to face. The Soviet occupation that replaced the Nazi one was different in character, but equally oppressive in its own ways, and the resistance networks that had fought against Germany found themselves viewed with suspicion by the new authorities. Anna and other resistance leaders were interrogated about their activities, their connections, their political affiliations. The story of the blind pianist who had encoded messages into his performances was exactly the kind of intelligence tradecraft that interested Soviet security services, and Viktor found himself being debriefed by officers who wanted to understand his methods, to potentially replicate them for their own purposes. He cooperated because he had no choice, but he refused to perform for the Soviets, refused to allow his music to be used again as a vehicle for espionage. He had given everything to fighting the Nazis, had sacrificed his health and his sanity for that cause, and he would not repeat the experience for new masters. The Soviet authorities eventually lost interest in him when they realized he was too damaged, too unreliable to be useful, and they left him alone to try to rebuild whatever remained of his life in a city that was itself trying to resurrect from total destruction. Viktor Mendelsohn lived for another 32 years after the war ended, and in that time he never performed publicly again, never touched a piano in front of an audience, never allowed himself to return to the thing that had both defined him and nearly destroyed him. He survived through teaching, working with young musicians in Warsaw and later in Krakow, passing on technical knowledge while carefully avoiding any mention of the years when his performances had served purposes beyond art. The trembling in his hands never fully disappeared, and students would sometimes ask about it, would wonder why their teacher seemed to struggle with passages that should have been simple for someone of his training and experience. Viktor would deflect these questions with vague references to wartime hardships, never revealing the truth about what those hands had accomplished, about the 200 messages they had encoded and transmitted while Nazi officers sat mere feet away, applauding their own destruction. He died in 1977, largely forgotten by a world that had moved on to new conflicts and new heroes, his story known only to the handful of surviving resistance members who understood what he had risked and what he had sacrificed. The moral weight of Viktor's story resists simple categorization, and that resistance is precisely what makes it so profound and so necessary to remember. Was he a hero? Certainly, by any reasonable definition of the word, he was someone who risked everything to fight against evil, who used his unique gifts to save lives and disrupt the machinery of genocide. But the cost of that heroism was a kind of self-annihilation, a destruction of the person he had been before the war, in service of a role that consumed him entirely. The Viktor who survived the war was not the same Viktor who had made the decision to return to occupied Poland in 1939. And the question of whether that transformation was worth it, whether any cause justifies the complete expenditure of a human soul, remains unanswerable. What we can say with certainty is that Viktor's sacrifice was not abstract or theoretical, that it exacted a price measured in trembling hands and fractured memories and decades of silence about accomplishments that deserved to be celebrated. Heroes in real wars don't emerge unscathed and triumphant. They emerge broken and haunted, carrying scars that never fully heal. The question that Viktor's story demands we confront is uncomfortable and personal. What would you have done in his position? It's easy to imagine ourselves as brave when we're safe, to believe we would have made the same choices he made when we've never faced anything remotely comparable to the circumstances he endured. But the truth is that most people, when confronted with the prospect of encoding messages while surrounded by Gestapo agents, of living a triple life where one mistake meant torture and execution, of carrying in their mind information that represented the lives of hundreds of people, would have said no. They would have found reasons to refuse, would have prioritized their own survival, and no one could reasonably judge them for that choice. Viktor said yes, and he kept saying yes even when the cost became unbearable, even when his mind started to fragment under the pressure, even when the trembling in his hands should have been a sign to stop. Was that courage, or was it a kind of madness born from trauma and necessity? Perhaps it was both, and perhaps the distinction matters less than the results, less than the lives saved and the operations disrupted and the small victories won against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The deeper tragedy of Viktor's story is how completely it was erased from historical memory, how a man who accomplished something genuinely extraordinary spent the last 3 decades of his life in obscurity, while lesser accomplishments were celebrated and commemorated. This erasure wasn't accidental, but rather reflected uncomfortable truths about how we remember war and who gets to be remembered as heroic. Viktor was Jewish, operating in a post-war Poland where anti-Semitism didn't disappear with the defeat of the Nazis, where survivors often found it safer to minimize their identities and their wartime roles rather than claim recognition that might attract unwanted attention. He was also someone whose contribution couldn't be easily explained or understood without revealing intelligence methods that remained classified, whose story was too complex and too psychologically dark to fit into simple narratives of resistance and liberation. And perhaps most significantly, he was someone whose heroism had broken him visibly and permanently, whose trembling hands and fragmented speech made him an uncomfortable reminder of what war actually costs, rather than a convenient symbol of triumph and resilience. We prefer our heroes intact and inspirational, not damaged and disturbing. This video exists because Viktor's story deserves better than obscurity, because the 200 messages he memorized and encoded and transmitted deserve to be recognized as one of the most remarkable intelligence operations of the entire war, and because the price he paid demands acknowledgement even if we can never fully repay the debt. When you close this video and return to your life, you'll carry with you the knowledge of what one blind pianist accomplished in the darkness of occupation, and that knowledge changes something fundamental about how we understand courage and sacrifice and the human capacity for resistance against overwhelming evil. Viktor Mendelsohn will never be as famous as the generals and politicians whose names fill history books, but what he did was no less significant, no less worthy of remembrance. His story is a reminder that heroism often happens in silence, that the most important battles are sometimes fought not with weapons but with memory and music, and the willingness to risk everything for a cause greater than survival. The next time you hear classical music, particularly pieces by Chopin or Rachmaninoff, remember that once upon a time those beautiful sounds carried messages that helped save lives, and remember the man whose blind fingers transformed art into resistance, beauty into warfare, and his own sanity into a weapon against fascism. That's the story they didn't teach you in school, and that's exactly why it matters.